and welcome everyone, both in person and online, to this fifth DAS lecture this term. And my name is Mike Jaak, and I'm a doctoral student here at Campion Hall. And it is my joy and honor to introduce this fifth lecture on the Call of Discipleship. So without any further delay, I'll give you Jim, and maybe we can start.
Thank you, Mikey. One of the great pleasures here is I'm always surprised by who's going to introduce me. So, Mikey, thanks for that. So, discipleship, the call to discipleship. While the first four lectures were designed to prepare us for the moral life by developing a theological anthropology that is deeply connected and that regards simultaneously both the personal and the social in talking about moral self-understanding and moral agency in light of vulnerability, recognition, and conscience, the remaining four lectures are now pathways for realizing the both and of the personal and social Catholic approach to life. I begin with discipleship and subsequently build on that with grace and sin in the next lecture, virtues in the seventh, and the communion of saints, the works of mercy, and the Beatitudes in the eighth. This lecture claims that a discipleship ethics best names the type of vulnerable ethics a Christian should appropriate today. Inasmuch as disciples are always understood as a collective identity with very different personal expressions, it seems a near perfect point of departure for constructing a Christian virtue ethics out of a theological anthropology based on the connectedness of vulnerability and recognition. This lecture proceeds in three parts. The first is the remarkable work of Fritz Tillmann, a biblical theologian silenced by Rome in 1912 for editing a volume of essays in which one of his contributors acknowledged the thesis of the then emerging Q source, that is, a second source for the Synoptic Gospels. Tillmann ended up becoming a moral theologian, developing a biblically based moral theology in which discipleship was central to his work. What you might find surprising is that Tillmann's promotion of the idea of discipleship in the beginning of the last century was innovative and successful. Second, I then turned to Gerhard Lofink's Jesus of Nazareth, What He Wanted and Who He Was, to investigate his understanding of discipleship that gives, I think, greater depth to the meaning of the term discipleship. Next, I investigate two other works, Richard Burridge's Imitating Jesus, an Inclusive Approach to New Testament Ethics, and Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Finally, I conclude with a reflection on discipleship by looking at the sixth sign in John's Gospel, the healing of the man born blind. Throughout, I hope my earlier claims on the significance of vulnerability and recognition as the conditions for moral agency in conscience emerge. So first, Fritz Tillmann, 1874 to 1953. On May 10th, 2003, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger decided to focus on a Vatican ruling regarding a biblical commentary that, quote, had to be banned and withdrawn from sale because one contributor, Friedrich Wilhelm Meyer, as the Cardinal explained, quote, sustained the so-called two-source theory accepted today by almost everyone, the Cardinal added. That two-source theory held that Matthew, Mark, and Luke each had their own source, but they each had access to a text that today we call Q, that we have never seen, but which we posit because often enough each evangelist seems to be working with a common resource book. Not only was Meyer held accountable, but the editor, Fritz Tillmann, was as well. The Cardinal disclosed, this also brought Tillmann's and Meyer's scientific career to an end. Both were given the option of changing theological disciplines, however. Meyer did not take the offer and became instead a prison chaplain. Tillman did, and in the cardinal's words, became a top German moral theologian. He added, together with Theodor Steinbuchel and Theodor Münkner, he edited a manual of avant-garde moral theology which addressed this important discipline in a new way and presented it according to the basic idea of the imitation of Christ. In a strange sort of way, the cardinal seemed to be remarking that if the congregation had not been intolerant and, well, wrong, in not acknowledging what today is rather broadly accepted Q-source hypothesis, we might not have had this great moral theologian. With that as background, let us take a look at Tillman's contribution. Until 1912, Tillman had been a successful and influential biblical theologian. The English translations of the titles of his German works evidence the focus of the research that he did. For instance, The Son of Man, Jesus' self-understanding of his messianic nature in 1905. The Future Coming of Christ according to the Pauline Epistles, 1909. The Self-Understanding of the Son of God, the Foundation of the Synoptic Gospels, 1911. In a word, Tillman wanted to know, who did Jesus understand himself to be? In 1919, he wrote his first moral theological work, which focused on the personal and social in terms of the reception of Jesus' preaching, in its translation, personality and community in the preaching of Jesus. In 1934, he collaborated with Theodor Steinbuchel and Theodor Münkner on a 3-volume work which he edited entitled Die katholische Sittenlehren, Catholic Moral Theology. Steinbuchel wrote the first volume on philosophical foundations. Münkner authored the second on the epistemological and psychological foundations, and Tillman wrote the third, Die Idee der Nachfolger Christi, on the idea of the disciple of Christ. Tillman's volume was a tremendous success. 70 years after its publication, Karl-Heinz Kleber writes that in the search to express what the foundational principle of moral theology ought to be, Tillman came forward and named it discipleship. Others followed Tillman's lead. Kleber names Gustav Emek, Johannes Stelzenberger, Bernhard Häring, Gerard Gilman, and René Carpentier. In 1937, he published a more accessible text for laypeople, Die Meister ruft, The Master Calls, a handbook of morals for the layman. Contemporary reviewers recognized the importance of Tillman's handbook. One remarked that the new work presented a manual of lay morality not as a list of sins, but of virtues, animated by the idea of discipleship and guided by the scriptures. Another astutely observed 2 significant achievements. First, Tillman managed to distill all his previous work, especially Die Idee der Nachfolger Christi, into an integrated and accessible expression for interested lay readers. More importantly, he demonstrated that it was possible to create a sound moral theology based directly on Christian revelation. More recently, Johannes Reiter notes that Tillman's Christological accent in moral theology influenced a series of subsequent German authors, including Johannes Steinberger and Bernhard Häring. Häring's The Law of Christ follows Tillman's manual 17 years later in Germany, and in 1960, both books are published in English in the United States. Demonstrating in 1937 a biblically and Christologically based moral theology was, in my estimation, nothing short of miraculous. Catholic moral theology could not make the much-needed and extraordinarily urgent turn to the Bible if it did not have within its guild a superb scripture scholar. One can hardly imagine a moral theologian credibly developing a biblically based moral theology. Tillman's exile from the land of exegesis and his finding safety and sanctuary in the field of moral theology became itself the fundamental occasion for realizing one of the most significant developments in 20th century Roman Catholic moral theology. The English translation of the 1937 The Master Calls is divided into 5 parts: principles, love of God, love of self, love of neighbor, and social relations. The first 4 parts are roughly 80 pages each. The final is 35 pages long. Without a doubt, a work based on the threefold command of love was radically new. Principles begins with the fundamental idea of the following of Christ, accompanied by the words of Luke 9:23, and he said to all, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." The passage is key. The call of discipleship is addressed not to a few, but to all, quote, whom faith would lead to become his disciples. Tillman's selection of biblical texts underlining the universality of Jesus' summons offered to the whole church a way of imagining and anticipating a theologically educated laity bent on ministry and service. Highlighting the immensity and grandeur of the call, Tillman wrote, "The goal of the following of Christ is none other than the attainment of the status of a child of God." Here, Tillman offered 3 requisites: the realization of the very highest degree of religious demands and conduct, a willingness to undergo any sacrifices for the sake of the great task enjoined, and an absolute conformity to the will of God. These conditions were not matters of privacy or isolation. Quote, Christ's overall teaching concerning the new one, his duties and his position with regard to God and his kingdom excludes all isolation, whether in general or in particular, and points out directions and duties which tend toward the community. He concludes stating that that baptism supplies the essential foundation of discipleship. Through emphasis on the virtues, Tillman built a much-needed bridge to biblical theology. Here he focused more on character traits and internal dispositions rather than on specific external actions or norms as the moral manuals previously had done. After Tillman, those who work in biblical ethics frequently turn to the virtues as the most appropriate mode of conveying such an ethics. In fact, Tillman showed theologians that biblical ethics today must be the result of 2 competencies. First, an ability to convey, generally through exegesis, the original meaning of the biblical text. And this is what you need a biblical theologian to be involved in. And secondly, an ability to bridge that text's original understanding to the present through an ethical hermeneutics, normally considered to be virtue ethics. And this is why you need an ethicist. This normative claim for biblical ethics was first developed and articulated in Lucas Chan's Biblical Ethics in the 21st Century, Developments, Emerging Consensus, and Future Directions, where he appropriated the Tillman model. Later, in advancing the argument, Chan further explored how in contemporary biblical ethics, exegetes and ethicists collaborated together so as to tap into the much-needed double competency. Of course, the one person who did not need to find a collaborator to bridge the 2 fields was, in fact, the pathfinder who was exegete turned moralist, Fritz Tillman. As Chan notes, after Tillman, virtue ethics becomes the best way to translate the biblical summons to discipleship. Tillman's breakthrough is inestimable. First, as a scripture scholar, he derived from the scriptures an appropriate identity for the Christian agent, both personally and communally, discipleship. His proposal of this identity has had a lasting influence on moral theology. Second, he developed his argument into a vigorous academic text, Die Idee der Nachfolge Christi, which allowed him to engage his colleagues on the intellectual foundations of his proposal. Third, he made this idea universally accessible and concrete by writing a book for the laity. He also made the text extraordinarily comprehensive, never departing from the double insight that the text had to be fundamentally and exclusively based on Scripture. There are no other types of citations in the entire book, and the text had to give an anthropological shape to the ethical vocation of discipleship. Fourth, wisely he turned to the virtues, most appropriately because, as any reader of the New Testament will note, virtue is the language of Paul and the evangelist. Virtue is the moral, ethical language of the Hebrew Bible as well. Thus, entering into moral theology, he did not abandon scriptural language, but found in virtue the worthy bridge between scripture and moral theology. Fifth, coupled with this, the architectonic structure of the work, 2 parts bookending the threefold love command, placed charity at the very heart of his ethics. Revelation conveys the singular primacy of charity, a point subsequently argued by Gerard Gilman in his significant work, The Primacy of Charity. Sixth, as a new member of the Guild of Moral Theologians, Tillman gave his colleagues a text that became a paradigm for others, a biblical ethics based on discipleship. It was a pioneering text that summoned all the baptized to pursue the call to discipleship. It offered an identity that could be understood personally and communally, one discovered by the biblical foundations on the call, along with the virtues necessary to realize that call along the way. Above all, it was a pathway for following Jesus Christ, collectively and morally. As opposed to the previous manuals of moral theology, which explained what was sin and what was not, Tillman provided a person-oriented moral theology that expressed human vulnerable responsiveness by recognizing the call of Christ, the claim of the triple-based love command, and the virtues needed to make that response possible. Gerhard Lofink. Starting in 1996, I had the pleasure to team teach with the biblical exegete Daniel Harrington, first the Synoptic Gospels and virtue ethics, then Paul and virtue ethics, and then finally, just before his death in 2014, John and virtue ethics. As the editor of New Testament abstracts, Harrington wrote more than 35,000 reviews of New Testament publications, making him easily the best-read biblical theologian in history and the world. On the back cover of Gerhard Lofink's Jesus of Nazareth, What He Wanted, Who He Was, Harrington comments unequivocally, Lofink's Jesus of Nazareth is the best Jesus book I know. With that endorsement, I turn to the text. In the beginning of his work, Lofink notes that the definitive proclamation of the reign of God by Jesus makes clear that rescue, liberation, and salvation had all irrevocably begun. Significantly, Lofink wants to show the deep connection between the reign of God and the people of God. He sees the people of God as the best descriptive of all the baptized, and within that context reflects on those called to be disciples. In his chapter on the call to discipleship, Lofink notes that the term for discipleship, to follow, appears 80 times in the Gospels, but never as a noun, and only as a verb. Quote, it exists only as a concrete, visible, tangible event, basically meaning to walk behind. Discipleship, then, is a movement, an action. Lofink thinks that there might be a temptation to say that the following of a disciple is like a student who follows a rabbi. But Lofink wants to take us away from that presumption. He contrasts how those who follow Jesus are not like rabbinical students. First, rabbinical students mark the beginning of their studies by studying the Torah, not by following a particular rabbi. The Christian disciple, however, is emphatically called by Jesus to follow him. Lofink writes, there is not a single story in the rabbinical traditions in which a rabbi called a student to follow him. The reason is very simple. A rabbinic student seeks his or her own teacher. For Jesus, the call comes completely from him. For the rabbinical tradition, there is no call per se, but the decision to follow a rabbi is completely the student's. Second, Lofink notes that after a student chooses a rabbi as teacher, serving the teacher, quote, is an essential part of studying Torah. But in the scripture, it is Jesus who serves. Lofink reminds us, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many, Mark 10:45. Or, for who is greater, the one at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at table? But I am among you as one who serves, Luke 22:27. Here Lofink underlines that Jesus, by serving them, is teaching a new way of being together. Obviously, here we should see how the disciples are vulnerable to the one who serves, vulnerable to the others who are called, and vulnerable to those on the road. Third, rabbinical students learned of the Torah from the rabbi in a specific location, a mark of the school's stability. There was no, however, stabilitas loci with Jesus. We follow the one who has no place to lay his head, Luke 9:58. These three differences regarding call, service, and stability underline the vulnerable distinctiveness of Jesus' disciples. This leads Lofink to argue that the disciples follow Jesus in gathering people for the reign of God. Lofink then pursues a subsequent chapter, The Many Faces of Being Called, where he asks whether Jesus' goal was that everyone in Israel would become a disciple. Is that Jesus' goal, that everyone in Israel would become a disciple? While noting that in the Acts of the Apostles, the disciples refers to the whole community, he considers this a unique usage, going back to the earliest Jerusalem community. He also acknowledges that Matthew 28:19 has the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. But still he asks whether being in the church equals being called to discipleship. Tillman based the call on discipleship precisely on the response of being baptized. But Lofink argues Jesus does not call everyone to follow him. The proclamation of the reign of God culminates in the call, repent, and believe the good news, but not follow me and become my disciple. Lofink concludes he nowhere makes being a disciple a requirement for participation in the reign of God. Moreover, he adds that, quote, life toward the reign of God, in sociological terms, participation in the Jesus movement, allowed for some very different ways of life. Certainly, Lofink recognizes many men and women in the New Testament beyond the 12 as called to become disciples. But he insists, quote, Jesus by no means called everyone who met him openly and in faith to be his disciple. He names those as other participants in the story, like Bartimaeus in Mark 10:46-52, or, quote, resident members of the Jesus movement, as in those in Lazarus' household, or occasional helpers like, quote, Joseph of Arimathea, or those whom Jesus does not stop who are doing things in his name, Mark 9:39-40. Lofink's overriding concern is that one not be identified as second class if they are not considered a disciple. He writes, not everyone can be a disciple, since discipleship also presupposes a special call from Jesus. It does not depend on the will of the individual. It can be that someone wants to follow Jesus but is not made his disciple. It should be noted, however, that Lofink does not establish how today one is called to discipleship. Tillman, on the other hand, sees baptism itself as the call to discipleship. Lofink concludes these observations, noting that attempts to suggest disciples are top tier and others are second tier ignores, quote, the unity of the people of God and the organization of all its members toward the same goal. In our first book together, Jesus and Virtue Ethics, Building Bridges Between New Testament Studies and Moral Theology, Dan Harrington noted that, as we see in the difference between Tillman and Lofink, quote, there has been a long-standing debate on this issue. Some contend that the discipleship teachings are incumbent on all Christians. Others make a distinction between a Christian elite and ordinary Christians. He responded to the question, helpfully explaining that the major problem, quote, posed by these synoptic gospel texts is the applicability or transfer to Christians beyond the first century. Or to put the same point in another way, can we use Jesus' instructions to his disciples in Christian moral theology today? Harrington resolves the debate, as I would, by saying that, quote, one can and should discern some core values in the discipleship passages in the Synoptic Gospels: absolute dedication to God's kingdom, sharing in Jesus' mission, a simple lifestyle, willingness to subordinate or forgo human ties and physical comforts, and the assurance of opposition and suffering for the sake of the gospel. That can give shape to Christian discipleship in any age or place. These core values, he concludes, can serve as the starting points for reflecting on the use of Jesus' discipleship teachings in moral theology today. Moreover, Lofink prompts us to see that though discipleship might well be a predominant way of discussing what a Christian self-understanding before God ought to be, we should be careful to not identify discipleship as a privileging self-understanding. Furthermore, I would suggest that in cultivating the role of discipleship, that we be exhorted to consider how it is that we do feel called. I think as discipleship ethics continues to advance beyond the call of baptism, that we need to hear from persons and communities how they understand themselves hearing that call beyond the invitation to baptism. Additionally, Lofink's emphasis on Jesus as the rabbi who uniquely serves and therein teaches us a new form of being together helps us to see how the call of discipleship is beyond being a solitary call. It is a call to become vulnerably incorporated with those other disciples, that is, in a collective, already promoting Jesus' summons for the further realization of the kingdom. Finally, it is good for us to recognize that the first movement in discipleship comes from the call of God, who through Christ invites us to follow him along his way by his grace. The tradition, using journey imagery, appreciates the dynamism of the call to follow. If we are going to hear him, we are going to have to keep pace with him. To stand still on the way of the Lord is then to recede. The film, I don't know how many of you have seen it, the film Pasolini's The Gospel of Matthew depicts the pace of Jesus. You see a profile of Jesus walking across the screen for a good, I would say, 95, 100 minutes. He's not. He's very quick across the screen, and the disciples are trying to keep pace with him. In fact, they're not able to. This is an insight long regarded, though, in the tradition. Gregory the Great wrote, "Certainly in this world the human spirit is like a boat, foolishly fighting against the river's rush. One is never allowed to stay still, because unless one forges ahead, one will slide back downstream." Bernard of Clairvaux emphasized how idleness cannot be a disciple's stance by writing, "To not progress on the way of life is to regress." Thomas Aquinas conflated their insights, though he quoted them, into a motto: to stand on the way of God is to withdraw. I should mention that last week I had the occasion to be involved in a conference on Amoris Laetitia, and at that conference we had a papal audience. And at the end of the papal audience, the Pope said, the way of the Christian is never to turn backwards. It's never to go backwards. We're always called to go forward. And in hearing him say that, I was thinking of these words themselves, this long tradition of understanding that the call to discipleship is indeed to follow in the footsteps that are moving ahead. Disciples are always called to move forward so as to not lose sight of the one who summons us. Richard Burridge. As Harrington introduced me to Lofink, it was Lucas Chan who introduced me to Richard Burridge's Imitating Jesus, an inclusive approach to New Testament ethics. Burridge offers a hypothesis that the genre of the four Gospels is one of ancient Greco-Roman biography. Arguing that the literary genre is crucial to the interpretation of the text, he stresses, as Chan writes, quote, the need to focus on the subject in the text, the inseparability between the subject's words and deeds as presented in the text, and the turn to the subject's character, which invites us to imitate the subject and appropriate the subject's virtues. Vulnerably responding to his call means being able to recognize in his life what he wants from us. Nowhere is this more the case than in John's Gospel, according to Burridge. Burridge begins his treatment of John asking, is Jesus a great moral teacher or a friend of sinners? The question is key. The gospel is told through a series of encounters: the call of Peter and Nathanael, the marriage at Cana, the woman by the well, the man born blind, the raising of Lazarus, the Last Supper with the 12. At the end of the gospel, we have met Jesus in each of his relationships, whether with the Samaritan woman or Peter, with Martha or Thomas, with the man born blind or Nicodemus, with the Magdalene or Mary of Bethany. While many argue that there are signs in the Gospel of John, I emphasize instead the robust dialogical encounters within and beyond each of the signs. In each encounter, Jesus and the other become better known because Jesus reveals to the other what he knows of them. Think here of Nathanael, or the Samaritan woman, Thomas, or especially Peter, at Peter's own call, Peter at the Last Supper, or Peter on the beach. In each, Jesus enters into the life of the other in a transformative way. In terms of a discipleship ethics, through it, we become vulnerable not only to him, but to ourselves, both personally and collectively. There is something very prayerful about these encounters. We are almost eavesdropping on contemplative conversations. These intimate encounters are for Christians deeply moral ones. They are based on love, expressed in faith, maintained by fidelity, and usually accompanied by an instruction about an act of hospitality. These four virtues, love, faith, fidelity, and hospitality, are the moral instructions the reader of John learns. So much of John's gospel focuses on love. Even the few encounters with unknown persons, for instance, the Samaritan woman or the man born blind, become intimate engagements that are generous, tender, and fairly visceral. Even when Jesus gives the love command, the setting is not public, as in the Synoptic Gospels, where there is public questioning and answering. In John, the love command, which is more a gift than a command, is given where after Jesus has washed the disciples' feet at the Last Supper, John 13, 34 to 35. In fact, the command is incredibly horizontal. Love one another as I have loved you. In this instance, as Burridge notes, there is no vertical movement to or from God in the Johannine love commandment. It echoes Lofink's new way of vulnerably being together. These loving encounters prompt deeper and more explicit faith. For John, faith is a moral action. We believe in response to the gift given. To not believe is to reject the gift, the person of Jesus. The testimonies of faith from Martha to the man born blind are all deeply relational commitments to Jesus. Indeed, for John, faith is an abiding with Jesus. Jesus' great injunction on the love command is not primarily about is primarily about accompanying. Abide in me is his constant injunction, but it is an abiding with a Jesus heading to Jerusalem. So that faith is always vulnerably relational, and therefore the failure to believe is also a failure to be faithful to Jesus. Sin, then, is precisely walking away from faith, of being unfaithful or lacking fidelity. Jesus' resurrection admonitions are remarkably moral as he reprimands the disciples at Emmaus, Thomas in the upper room, or Peter on the beach. Fidelity is the trademark of the disciple of Jesus. Believe and remain in my love. Believe and abide in my love. These are Jesus' fundamental injunctions. For John, sin is the failure to stay in love and believe Jesus. Finally, if anything concrete ever happens in John's gospel, it is usually an act of hospitality. There is the wedding feast of Cana. But consider other gestures, like Jesus cooking fish, the Samaritan woman offering water, or the disciples of Emmaus inviting him to stay. The key hospitable gesture is the washing of the feet, which is an expression of the love command, to love as Jesus loves. Moreover, that lesson is to be imitated. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. John 13. Howard Thurman. In 1935, from the chapel of the famous historically black research university, Howard University, the dean of its Rankin Chapel, Howard Thurman, published an essay, Good News for the Underprivileged. It recognized those long overlooked. In 1949, that argument developed into his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, a groundbreaking text that precedes any work in liberation or black theology. In many ways, Thurman asks a series of questions that later writers like James Cone, Willie James Jennings, M. Sean Copeland, and Brian Massengale would later pursue in black theology, and that Gustavo Gutierrez and others pursued in liberation theology. This is really one of the foundational texts of a liberation or black theology. In 1949, he opened his book with this recognition: many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and the life of Jesus of Nazareth, but few of these interpretations deal with what the teachings and the life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. He added, "It is urgent that my meaning be crystal clear. The masses of men live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. What does our religion say to them? This issue is not what it counsels them to do for others, whose need may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. The search for an answer to this question he posed is perhaps the most important religious quest of modern life." Thurman reiterates repeatedly, not that the gospel provides no hope for the masses with their backs against the wall, but that religion offers no hope. He writes, "I belong to a generation that finds very little that is meaningful or intelligent in the teachings of the church concerning Jesus Christ." This is coming from the most significant African-American theologian in the United States. I'll just read that again. "I belong to a generation that finds very little that is meaningful or intelligent in the teachings of the church concerning Jesus Christ." This is a significant utterance. He adds, "It cannot be denied that too often the weight of the Christian movement has been on the side of the strong and the powerful and against the weak and the oppressed, this despite the gospel." He laments, "The crucial question then is this: is there any help to be found in the religion of Jesus that can be of value here?" Thurman teaches us that we cannot develop a discipleship for the well-heeled, for the privileged. We need discipleship for those like those who are called, that is, those most in need of the call, those with their backs against the wall. Thurman draws much from an understanding of the historical Jesus by noting, the Christian church has tended to overlook its Judaic origins, but the fact is that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew of Palestine when he went about his father's business, announcing the acceptable year of the Lord. Thus, Thurman insists on grasping three historical facts. Jesus was a Jew, a poor Jew, and a member of a minority group in the midst of a larger, dominant, and controlling group. In light of these facts, Rome, according to Thurman, stole Israel from the Jews. The Jews were the disinherited. Thurman writes, "No Jewish person of the period could deal with the question of his practical life, his vocation, his place in society, until first he had settled deep within himself this critical issue. This is the position of the disinherited in every age." Then he adds, "The basic fact is that Christianity, as it was born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed. That it became, through the intervening years, a religion of the powerful and the dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and life of Jesus. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Wherever his spirit appears," Thurman writes, "the oppressed gather fresh courage, for he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. The grace of discipleship redounds to the disciples themselves. Though most of the original 12 lost their lives painfully, the accounts that we have from the Acts of the Apostles is that without a doubt, they grew in grace exponentially as disciples of Christ. Thurman looked for how those with their backs against the wall could hear the call to discipleship if their inheritance of the gospel call has been taken by a religion that brings good news solely to the privileged. So as to help those with their backs against the wall, he insists, quote, that a profound piece of surgery has to take place in the very psyche of the disinherited before the great claim of the religion of Jesus can be presented. The great stretches of barren places in the soul must be revitalized, brought to life before they can be challenged. Thurman turns to excise fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, dedicating 3 of the 5 chapters to these self-crippling vices. In the final chapter, he argues that the religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central. He writes, "The religion of Jesus says to the disinherited, love your enemy. Take the initiative in seeking ways by which you can have the experience of a common sharing of mutual worth and value. It may be hazardous, but you must do it." I think what Tillman and Lofink miss is that the call of discipleship is redemptive for the one who is called, for those who are called. The message that Thurman seeks to find is the message of relief for the captive, or relief for the sick soul that we saw from William James. The one called is not only called to follow Jesus and promote the kingdom, but called paradoxically for her or his own sake. For indeed, the call of discipleship is itself redeeming for the one who follows the Lord. Though ironically, one cannot pursue one's own redemption when needs instead to pursue Jesus, who does the redeeming. By becoming vulnerable to Jesus, we become vulnerable to ourselves, those who journey with us, and those who serve along the way. Of course, I do not mean this in some jejune way. Certainly, Peter followed Christ and was crucified upside down. Paul was executed, and Campion was hung and drawn and quartered a few blocks away. But in each, the call was, as Thurman was among the first to note, liberating. By answering the call, each became someone that otherwise they could not have been. A Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day could experience trials and tribulations, a long loneliness even, yet the tangible experience of rebirth and redemption is itself healing and life-giving. Thurman, the mentor of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., leads us to see another reason why Jesus called fishermen, tax collectors, and others to be his disciples, and why he does the same today. Liberation is constitutive of the call to discipleship. Finally, the pericope, the man born blind. On March 5th, 1989, Gustavo Gutierrez preached at Blackfriars, here in Oxford, on the liberating of the man born blind, talking of how the man was liberated from his illness, his poverty, and his alienation, and how he and those around him were freed from, quote, an arrogant and false idea of what religious knowledge is. It might be good to remember that in the man born blind, John 9, 1-41, Jesus and his disciples see the man and ask Jesus, whose sin caused his blindness, the man's or his parents'? Jesus responds that it was neither, but that God's work might be shown. Jesus heals the man by putting mud on his eyes and telling him to wash in the temple pool. When the man is cured and returns to the temple, neither Jesus nor his disciples are present. People are confused when they see the man. Could this, they ask, be the same man, born blind, who has been begging at the temple? He insists that he is the same man and that the one who did it is Jesus. As he is questioned by the crowd, investigated by the Pharisees, abandoned by his parents, and finally rejected from the temple, in each instance, he confesses that Jesus is his healer, and additionally, that Jesus could not be a sinner because only an agent of God could do this miracle. He progressively becomes more articulate in witnessing what Jesus has done, and effectively becomes Jesus' own witness. This witnessing leads to him being denounced by literally everyone to whom he was ever related. Now, literally outside the temple, the man is found by Jesus again. They speak together. Jesus discloses to him that he is the Son of Man, and the man worships him. This is easily my favorite pericope in the scriptures. I love it because of the way Jesus is not present as the man vulnerably tries to explain his healing. I also love it because his own healing is a part, if you will, of his own call to discipleship. Finally, I love it because he grows in vulnerability as he grows in his recognition of Jesus. I would like to emphasize several points, and I take these comments, these exegetical comments, from Caroline Lewis in her commentary on John. Caroline Lewis is the Marbury Anderson Chair in Biblical Preaching at Luther Seminary, St. Paul, Minnesota. The first point she makes is to understand that the healing of the man is intimately linked to the discourse on the Good Shepherd in chapter 10. Lewis writes, quote, "In the discourse, Jesus depicts himself as both the door and the shepherd, and these images are meant to unpack key themes presented in chapter 9. In other words, the blind man and Jesus have already acted out Jesus' words in 10, 1-18. As a result, to separate the sign from the discourse is to dislodge the full meanings of Jesus as both door and shepherd, and to reduce the healing and witness of the blind man to just one more fantastical work by Jesus. Second, the healing of the man happens without the man's own request. Of course, we need only to think of Paul's own conversion to realize that Jesus' calling of discipleship is sometimes what I call an unsolicited interruption. Still, Lewis highlights what many overlook: Jesus' recognition of the man who he sees first. The healing, she argues, is really a call to discipleship. She writes, "At first, the man born blind appears to be only a pawn or a prop in a plan about which he has no knowledge. Yet this is not Jesus' first reaction to the blind man. As Jesus is walking along, he sees the blind man. In this blind man from birth, Jesus sees a disciple, a witness, just as he did with the Samaritan woman at the well. There is, at the outset, an act of recognition. Third, verses 6-7 narrate the sign itself. Jesus' making of mud recalls how this gospel begins in the recollection of creation. While not the same word, dust in Genesis, mud in John 9, the allusion to the creative act of God is unquestionably at work, she writes. Fourth, integral to the sign is the man's listening. Lewis makes a critical note. The blind man listens to Jesus' voice and follows his directions. This is exactly what the mother of Jesus commands at the wedding feast of Cana. It's exactly the response that the royal official gives of listening to the command in chapter 4. And it's the same that happens when the man who is ill for 38 years listens and obeys the command to pick up his mat and walk. In each pericope, the call to listen and act accordingly is constitutive of the miracle. Listening and heeding the voice of Jesus will become an important part when it comes to discipleship. As Lewis writes, the blind man first hears Jesus, just as Jesus' sheep hear his voice in chapter 10. Fifth, the man's growth in understanding who Jesus is progresses just as the Samaritan woman did at the well. Noteworthy is that the man's sight is progressing without Jesus being present, a significant theme throughout this gospel. Quote, Blessed are those who do not see and yet come to believe. John 20:29. The blind man will develop in his belief in Jesus, not with Jesus being present, but by witnessing to Jesus' presence in his life. The actual testimony has everything to do with the capacity to believe. Sixth, as he grows in faith, he begins to live out his discipleship rather quickly. This emerges when the man takes the upper hand in the discourse in verse 27 and responds to the Pharisees' insistence that he repeat the account of his being able to see. He answers, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Lewis writes, "Do you want to become one of his disciples?" is the theme at the heart of this entire passage. What it means to be a disciple, what discipleship is, and what characteristics of a disciple are. The blind man names what is at stake in these two chapters, hearing and discipleship. I would like to add growing vulnerably in responsive recognition to Jesus as well. Seventh, the hearing and listening between Jesus and the disciple is mutual. Lewis first comments on how, in verse 35, Jesus hears that the Pharisees have thrown out the man born blind, and notes the mutuality between Jesus and his disciples who hear him. She then focuses on how to find. It's the same verb that the same verb used when Jesus calls the first disciples, by first finding Philip and then calling him to follow me. In the calling of Philip, Andrew, and Simon, the verb to find is used 5 times in only 5 verses. Lewis notes, it is against this backdrop and thematic focus that we are to read and interpret the implication of Jesus finding the man born blind. As a result, the blind man is now a disciple, found by Jesus, a sheep in the fold. Like the man born blind, we are blessed because though we do not see him, we hear his voice and follow him. The call to discipleship is one that we hear personally and collectively. It is a call in which we are found by Christ and invited to vulnerably recognize him. The entire account ironically ends with the comment in 10:20, "Why listen to him?" which takes us back to the very beginning of chapter 9. The question is not to be answered, I think, for those who do not hear the call, but precisely for those who do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. So we now have time for questions, which those who are participating online may also write questions to the chat, and I will read them aloud. But also people who are here in person are very, very free to ask questions.
So thank you very much, Jim, for that very engaging exploration of discipleship ethics. I suppose one question that you talk about virtue ethics as the best way to translate the biblical ethic. You begin with Paul, then the evangelist, then the Hebrew scriptures as well. I think that would surprise many people because they might say, well, command is the primary moral discourse in the Bible, or parable, or they would refer to a number of different genres. But I think they'd be surprised that virtue is it in the Bible? Is it the best way to translate the Bible? How would you express that?
Well, the 7th lecture is based on that answer. I mean, I always put these questions off by saying it's going to be in my future lecture. But I mean, I think it's really key. Paul, it's all virtue. I mean, you can think of, he gives you a list of virtues, he gives you a list of vices, he gives you the love command, he gives you humility, he gives you a variety of virtues that we're supposed to be looking at, we're supposed to be engaging. In the gospel, the command is usually be rather than do. And it's more a command about dispositions that you're supposed to develop. I think we see throughout that. We see also, though, in the Hebrew Bible, if you go to wisdom literature, you can't escape any of the virtues that are being used in it. throughout, if we wanted to get a sense of what is it that we're called to be or do, it's almost always written in the key of virtue. There are some commands in some text, but it's not as across the board the way virtue language is. But that's what virtue language is about. Virtue language is about instructing how one is to live the moral life. And the instruction is generally not to do this or that, though you need certain actions in order to acquire or develop or grow in the virtues. But it's also to put on an image of what you're called to be. And for us, the image is Christ. But then we have to say, what are the images that we see in Jesus that we want to emulate? It could be the mercy of Jesus, the redemptive mercy of Jesus. That when we look at the cross of Jesus hanging on the cross, we see the redemptive mercy of Jesus. Is that not something that we're called to hear and heed? We hear him talking about being obedient to his Father and to his Father's will. Is that not something that we're called to consider and to make our own? He tells us to abide with me, to be faithful to me. But then, more than anything, he tells us to love. And we could think of love as simply a visceral connectedness that we have, or we could think of it as a virtue that is a perfection of those inclinations within us, in which we want to say a person who is loving is a person who has actually grown and become something that we find morally is exceptional. So these virtues are the way that I think resonate with the reading of the Bible. I do want to say that I'm not interested in excluding other types of ways of talking about instructions. I think that, anybody who does divorce and marriage wants to know, well, what did Matthew say? What did Peter say? What did Paul say? And they want to pay attention to these texts. But those type of injunctions are not that prevalent in the new law. Thomas tells us, what does the new law come down to? He basically says charity. It comes down to charity. That's what the new law comes down to. The old law comes down with a lot of different injunctions. But even if we are much more interested in the Hebrew Bible than maybe others were before us, I think one finds in those texts, too, the way that people are called to be, who the people of Israel are called to be. So I do think that there is a way that an argument could be made twofold. One that, as a matter of fact, of all the different forms of moral instruction that there could be, for the most part, they are about virtue. And secondly, they are the most effective modes for communicating to a people who they should become. Because that's what the election of Israel by God is. That's what the election of Jesus, of his disciples, are. He wants them to become a certain type of people. And a certain type of people normally are branded, if you will, by a virtue. See how they love one another. That is effectively how Christians, when they're first identified in Antioch, are identified by the quality of the love they had for one another. That was not a visceral love. That was a love that was perfected through practices aiming at the realization of a virtue.
Thank you.
But come back for the 7th lecture, please. It's much better than that.
Yeah.
Who was it who was talking about doing kind of an etymology of the disciple, the Nachfolger, as one coming after or following?
Tillman.
Tillman. Does he do anything looking at kind of the Greek or the Latinate kind of disciple?
Yes, he does, but I was more interested in the Meisterruf than the De Nachfolger Christi. So, but what he does in it, so he does these two works. The first one is the much more academic, rigorous work that is trying to convince the entire biblical community of the paradigmatic significance of this concept of discipleship. I think what's important for us to appreciate is, I think most of us think discipleship is like, Jesus said, make them all disciples, but as a matter of fact, discipleship is not used as a way of referring to the people of God until basically, at this point, Tillman if you will, reintroduces a familiarity with the text of saying this is what we're called to. So there's some, at least in Catholic circles, and so, you know, the actual specifics of what he means by it and Nachfolge is, I think, something you'd have to find by looking at the first work rather than the second. The second work is basically, as I said, it's based on this principle that he enunciates, and then he goes to the threefold love command. Love God, love yourself, and love your neighbor, in that order, the Augustinian order. And then he concludes with the social ramifications of the threefold love command.
Thank you, Jim. My question follows a bit on Joe's, I think. I was wondering whether you would distinguish, at least in English usage, relevant, would you wish to distinguish between Nachfolge, as translated as discipleship, sometimes it's also translated imitation, and you used in your answer to Nick's question, emulation. And I wonder whether you think those are relevantly different in some respects, or in different contexts, or we use them synonymously.
I tell you, I was knocked off my feet when I read Lofink saying that the word for discipled is not a noun. It's a verb, to follow. I find that really helpful to understand that we're called to follow. So I guess I would use that as the key the key way to understand the notion of disciple, to follow. I was really surprised, and he makes a good deal about it. I don't know what else to say other than that whatever words we use, I'm trying to say it has to come down to follow. And I think that has a dynamic meaning to it, so that it's in the following that we've come to understand. That's why, you know, I conclude with the man born blind, not because it's my favorite pericope, but because I think it is instructive. It is the sixth sign. It's just before the raising of Lazarus. It's before everything happens, if you will. And now he's trying to say what this is all about. So the healing of the man born blind is, I think, Lewis is right in saying it's a call to discipleship explication by listening rather than sight. Very clever the way she does this and the way you start reading the text. So I'm interested in a discipleship ethics that really emerges not from religion, if you will, but from the scriptures. And this notion of following, I think, is really rather compelling. The Acts of the Apostles, you know, today in the first reading has that poor guard in the cell. All of a sudden, he has almost this earthquake occur, and he doesn't know what's going on. And he's about to kill himself, and Paul stops him. And there's this, he doesn't know what to do. And then he's told, believe in the Lord Jesus. And he does. And that injunction is not a moment. It's the beginning of a life. And that's what I love about follow. Follow means that somebody is going, so this is not a moment in a life. All of a sudden, the moment is now a trajectory. So I'm interested in how do you develop virtues along the way? I'm interested in how do you develop collectives along the way? How do you develop them when you come to different villages and you meet people along the way? So this following, I think, is a way of really opening up the scriptures to us, but also opening up to us the experiences that we have as disciples of Jesus. Oh, I really love this notion of follow, which is what led me, I think, to take the man born blind as because one only imagines he has nowhere to go. You know, his parents threw him under the bus, the people threw him out of the temple, and those who used to give him money when he begged from them are no longer liking him. And that's why Jesus goes to find him, because he goes back to those who are having a need. And the presumption is that he is now going to, after he worships him, he's going to follow him.
So, Jim, one of the writers who developed the idea of a discipleship ethic that's very much scripturally based is William Spahn, who I know you knew personally and you admire his writings a lot. I suppose what William Spahn brings in addition to the authors you've talked about is spirituality, and in particular spiritual exercises, as a way of entering into these stories of discipleship that you've been alerting us to. So could you say anything about that, either something that Bill Spahn himself contributes in that regard, or what you would say about spirituality as part of this discipleship ethic?
Yeah. Well, the cheaper answer would be that that's actually next lecture. One of the things I will do in the next lecture, but I'm going to give it a little longer. One of the things I'm doing in the next lecture is I start not with Tillman, but I start with the other two major reformers. One is Lotin, Damo Don Lotin, a Benedictine from Belgium, who really wants to develop a prudent-based, conscience be your guide, taking responsibility for your life, incorporated with the virtues, positive, cost-oriented life of Christ. And then the other is Gilman, who gives us the primacy of charity. And the first is interested in giving us, if you will, the relationship of moral theology to systematic, or what was called then dogmatic theology. Lotin is interested in incorporating moral theology as a theological and not a canonical teaching. And then secondly, Gilman is interested in developing an asceticism that can support the moral life. And that's really what I'm going to do next time. But I'm not talking about Spone, so let me say something about Spone in answer to concrete to your question. So Spone does an interesting project. He invited a group of people together to interrogate how could we build biblical ethics. And he begins to look at a variety of ways. He's looking at, he's very influenced by David Tracy. He's influenced by how do you read imaginatively, how do you appropriate insights, how do you apply them, and how do you live them. He does a book subsequent to all these conversations that he has over the course of several years called Go and Do Likewise. And that is an invitation, if you will, to understand how discipleship is involved in the way one proceeds. He also will be talking about, with obvious awareness, which I haven't done in this lecture because I'm trying to do something more generic that I want to develop as how does this work out personally and collectively in the next one. I haven't talked about the social gospel. I have briefly touched on liberation theology. I haven't looked at the social impact of it. I don't think that Spone did either. I think Spone was really interested in developing an ethics that would be based on the scriptures and how could you read that. And I do think he comes up with the double competency implicitly. A curious thing about him is he never seems to have known Tillman. I will actually acknowledge that in Lofink's one book, there is no reference to Tillman either. Even though most German theologians were all reading Tillman, the two people who are pretty well known for talking about discipleship ethics do not. Herring, of course, acknowledges him. Gilman says he writes this because of Tillman. So it's really interesting that as a matter of fact, major figures sometimes don't read major figures. That's something worth considering, especially those of you who are in doctoral studies. It should bring you enormous consolation when you can simply say, I don't know, but then Spone didn't know Tillman. And that doesn't detract in any way from the originality nor the claims of his thing. Do you want to say something about what you would bring forward about Spone? Because my mind is on basically what I've been doing.
I think just to highlight what you said about moral imagination, being key for Spone, and in particular is that you referred very interestingly to these intimate dialogues in John's Gospel between Jesus and the man born blind, between him and Mary Magdalene and so on. And it's how does that become personal to us?
Yeah.
How do we find ourselves in those narratives? And for Spone, it's the moral imagination.
Yeah. He's
influenced by the spiritual exercises and the imaginative praying of the Gospels. But I think it's a helpful contribution as to how these narratives become live in our own lives in a different situation that we have to apply by analogy. The Go and Do Likewise title of his book. So it gives us a way of personally appropriating the ethic that you're talking about.
Right. And so that's why I'm now going to be looking at like Gilman on charity and what charity does and how that effectively changes us so that we can translate, so we can imagine, so that we can have an embodied way of following the Lord. So, and in fact, what I will be doing is also not leaving sin off on its own, but sin always in Christian theology needs to be understood in the context of that call, in the context of that imagination, and in the context of people who are striving to follow in the footsteps of Christ. So.
I think we still have time for one more question, which actually there is one online, so I will ask that. So there's a question, can you say a little more about those not called the disciples being part of the kingdom, and then that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, I think there's three things happening with loafing. And there are, as Harrington tries to make clear, that not everybody is on board on the fact that baptism gives you discipleship, or that that's equal to hearing the call. As Loafing tries to say, the call is to repent and believe the good news. That's what he believes is the call, to repent and believe the good news. Two actions, if you will. The issue to call and be a disciple is actually giving you a category. So there is no other category to offer them. Loafing doesn't offer another category. He thinks of these other people. He thinks of Joseph of Arimathea. He thinks of Bartimaeus. He thinks of those who are healing in the name of Jesus and doing this good, but Jesus and his disciples don't even know who these people are. I don't find him all that compelling in these examples, that just because the injunction isn't there, especially when you have the Acts of the Apostles saying that the community of disciples was developing, the identity of the baptized of the church following Christ are called disciples. And Matthew's gospel ends by saying, baptize all and make them disciples. So it strikes me that that's there. But I think what he's interested in is, let's be careful that we're not putting a burden on people who are called to follow, to hear the call of Christ. And that if we give them something that has an athleticism of discipleship, it could, in a way, actually frustrate them in their ability to respond to that. How does somebody who, but as a matter of fact, we know in the tradition that all sorts of spiritualities were cultivated for those who were sick to follow the Lord. We know of contemplatives who were deeply involved in the mission of the church and the promotion of it by their contemplation and by their support in it. So I don't know who else, how you're not called to discipleship, but Pache. I think what he's most interested in, that's the way what I come to the conclusion, is to be careful of an elitism or a privileging of people who say that they're disciples, that this somehow gives them an entitlement and makes as second tier. He makes this comment second tier repeatedly at different places, that this could lead to a two-tiered system, and he's really against that. I'm all for that. I have no problem with that. But I don't think that there are categories for these people. When people are made deacons, it's not that they're not disciples. But the injunction is that they're made deacons. That's how the later church is developing. But I do think that the primary concept is disciples, but I have no problem with saying maybe it's not for everyone. And yet it's still for those who hear the call and accept it and live it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we unfortunately don't have any more time for questions, but I'm sure you can ask those afterwards as well. So this concludes this week's lecture, and I would also like to encourage everyone to come back here at the same time next Tuesday to hear the lecture on grace and sin.
And
So-
do you know who's going to do the introductions?
I don't actually.
He
So
does, but he's not going to say it.
okay, so it'll be a surprise. So.
Okay, good. Good to meet you.
All right, thank you very much.